Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot Podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Christina Dotchin, VP of Member Relations at the Enrollment Management Association. Christina and I have worked together for a long time. We collaborate on a bunch of different things. So having an opportunity to sit down and talk with her today is pretty cool. And today we're actually going to talk about something that I'm super passionate about, which is their just this idea of value and affordability. I've done a lot of work on the pod, so you probably you could go back into the archive and you can see a bunch of episodes dedicated to versions of this topic. EMA recently released a report called "An Independent School Education: Family Perceptions of Value and Affordability" that really digs into this. And so we're gonna break it all down, and we're gonna think about what does it all mean, how does it impact the business model, and just I know have an awesome conversation. But before we get into all that, just want to welcome Christina Dotchin to the podcast. Welcome, Christina.
Peter, thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure. I have been looking forward to this conversation all week.
Oh,
Any
fantastic.
to connect.
Always the best. Always the best. Hey, obviously we know each other, but like if somebody hasn't met you and they're not familiar with EMA, can you introduce yourself and the organization?
Absolutely. So I am the Vice President of Member Relations, as you mentioned. So over at EMA, I oversee the membership, business development, professional development, marketing, and communications teams. At EMA, we are a nonprofit global membership association that provides leadership, professional development, and assessment and enrollment tools such as the secondary school admission test and standard application online to meet the needs of more than 1,200 schools, educational consultants, and community-based organizations, as well as for parents and students. So just a quick sort of aside, for those who may or may not know, we are also in the process of merging with Educational Records Bureau, ERB. And so this spring, when that will be made official, our new name will be E3N. So we are also in the process of that as well. So it's been an exciting year.
Yeah, lots going on, it sounds.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's dig into the report. So families consistently talk about that they won't sacrifice quality for cost savings. Um, that's a really hard one for a lot of schools, and I got some thoughts on why. But like from your perspective and what you learn, how should they interpret this? And when they're thinking about not only their pricing strategy, but also like how do they literally communicate value to families in their markets?
It's a huge topic. Then this report was it was a pretty groundbreaking study that we were excited about because it offers a large scale analysis of how families across the socioeconomic spectrum perceive value and affordability of an independent school education. And so, not surprisingly, we found that families desire savings without sacrifice. And this is really challenging because our school leadership teams and trustees often feel that pressure to hold or reduce costs, reduce tuition. Yet many of those families are also very vocal about the need to maintain quality in especially around the certain things that they care about within the school.
Yeah.
So we're often in a bit of this conundrum, and it's important for us to understand price elasticity within the context of families applying to our schools, as well as those who are already in our communities when thinking about things like retention. So, in this report, we wanted to better understand price elasticity, which I think gets at some of this. So, we asked families actually to identify 3 school characteristics that were their top considerations when exploring independent schools. And these were things such as uh, access to high quality academic programs, school reputation, is the campus located, how close to home is it? All of those pieces. And so families picked their top 3. And then when they picked that, we said, okay, we'll take this a step further. And we asked them, would you consider a school that provided a lesser quality offering in the characteristics that you care about most in order to significantly reduce their educational expenses? And if they said yes, then we asked, okay, how much would that cost reduction have to be for you to seriously consider that perceived lesser quality option? And that's where we came up with these top factors, this big list of what families considered to be most important when they were looking at independent schools. And so at the top of the list, just like as what we found from our Ride to Independent Schools report, was that access to high quality academic programs. And so when I think about that, also, a takeaway here in terms of when we talk about that within our schools and what schools can focus on, we have this other report, which you know well, the State of the Independent School Enrollment Industry Report, where the most senior enrollment leaders are actually talking about uh, what are they focused on, what are their biggest challenges, what is the enrollment outlook, if you will. And one of the things when we match up data from this report and the Ride to Independent Schools report and the State of the Industry report is that consistently we see families, the top factor they're looking for in our schools is that access to high quality academics. And yet we know from the State of the Industry report that is when we asked those senior enrollment leaders to identify some of the top 3 to 5 factors that they are focusing their marketing and communications efforts on with prospective families, access to high quality academic programs was not listed in the top 5. And there's some reasons and some sort of hypotheses around that in terms of, I think that a lot of schools look at that factor and say, well, families who are already looking at independent schools must know we have high quality academic programs, when in fact it's important to keep in mind all of the competition that's out there, even charter schools, other folks that are out there that you're actually competing with, and the need for, especially as families are first considering our schools, to talk a lot about those offerings and those programs. But that's sort of a side tangent. I would say the big takeaway from this part of the report was actually that 61% of families would not consider a school that provided that lesser quality offering in any of their top factors in order to significantly reduce educational expenses. So when we think about this, if I picked access to high quality academics, I'm going to pay for that if I believe that's what a school is offering. And for those families that were willing to look at what they perceive as a lesser quality option in that factor, the cost reductions had to be really big, often greater than 10%. So that was a pretty big piece that we picked out of there, especially as schools are looking at what are they looking at in terms of, talking about price, tuition, all of those pieces.
So did the report get into anything around like, hey, like when the price hits this level, we're out?
We looked at willingness to pay, ability to pay, and then what families actually ended up paying.
Yeah.
So we did look at some of that, and of course, probably not surprising. Even when we looked at what schools the list price of tuition. So in terms of was it 10,000 or below, up to 70,000 and above. We did ask families, are you paying the full tuition price? Or are you receiving some sort of a discount or financial assistance? And as you can imagine, as the tuition went up, the more and more, the higher percentage, I believe in that 70,000 tuition level and above, it was something like 55% of families were not paying the full tuition. So we did ask questions around that, but we didn't quite get at what is your ultimate threshold in terms of that piece, which would be interesting to look at actually in the next report.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating. I mean, I think here's the challenge that I see. So I'm just going to think out loud, and if I go off the rails, could get me back on, please. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we have had to add a lot of services, right? The COVID accelerated was a number of things. Like we've had to double, triple down on SEL, signature programs. Like you just keep going down the list, right? There's a lot of important things that were necessary and are still necessary given, the kind of the rebound effect that we have to have coming out of COVID. And, and I see it with my own kids, right? Like there's just the needs are different. But what I find is that oftentimes these services aren't additive to revenue. So for instance, like you're not paying more for SEL. You're not necessarily paying more for signature. Now you're hoping that it's going to have enrollment outcomes, right? Like that you're going to have more families in the pipeline. You're going to be able to yield more and all the things. But I just talked to lots of schools where, what's ends up happening is, as their price continues to rise, they're naturally constraining their market. There are just fewer families each year as we raise our price that are willing to pay. Now, this isn't true in every market because not all markets are priced the same. And you also don't have Like, look, almost every state in the country has seen double digits declines in birth rates since 2008. Um, but then you have parts of the country that have been able to, mitigate that through migration patterns. Like if you're in Florida or Texas or, parts of the South where lots of people have been moving, then like you're probably not feeling a lot of this pressure, and your tuition is probably a little bit lower than other parts of the country. So, it's this really interesting conundrum of we have to do the right thing. It's expensive to do the right thing. We haven't really necessarily developed revenue streams that are significant enough for us to fund big chunks of operating. And so we're raising tuition each year, but then that's putting more pressure on our enrollment, and families aren't willing to take a lesser product. So you're sitting here and you're like, how do all these things kind of fit together? And what are some pathways forward for schools? Because like one of the things I think about a lot, Christina, is like if you're in a big urban market with lots of schooling options, you're probably going to have 2, 3, maybe 4 kind of lead schools in the market that are usually lead schools by virtue of they're big, right? You can actually build an independent school business model based on scale. Like you start to get north of 7, 8, 900 kids, and all of a sudden it becomes less expensive to run your school because, I mean, it's not less expensive. It's obviously more expensive, but you gain the benefits of efficiencies and scale when you start to get to that size. And by virtue of being able to do that, being at that size, like you can offer a lot of things. Because you said before, like there's never been a more competitive marketplace for independent schools right now. I mean, you just look at all the options: public schools, charter schools, magnet schools, online schools, home schools, micro schools, like just keep going down the list. Like there are a lot of options. And so as schools, we like have to up our promise in terms of the transformation that we're going to have for your kids and the outcomes that you desire. And so when I think about all these different pieces, and I look at, as the value proposition is getting amplified kind of at the higher end of the market with more, schools with more resources, the schools that are priced in a similar bands, but maybe are smaller, it's really hard to deliver the same level of services. But yet families are looking at it saying, well, this school A is doing this, but you're not doing this, but you're priced within like $5,000 or $6,000. So like, tell me why I'm not going to get all the things here that I get all the things there. And so there's lots of tensions and pressures that are kind of pushing on the market. And I think a lot about like, how do you approach that? And how can schools kind of reposition themselves in ways in order to, start to combat some of these trends? And look, I don't have a lot of great answers, but these are the things that I'm hearing from schools all over the country. I don't know. Like, again, I'm just kind of, I probably went off the rails, bring me back, but like, I don't know.
I think I think these are all important questions to ask, though. And what you're talking about here also is even just, the importance of that our schools, that we know our market, we know our competitors, we understand the financial model of our schools, what's working and what's not working, and that faculty and staff understand that as well. And I think you brought up something that hit for me, which was, it's almost kind of this, we're trying to be all things to all people for many of our schools. And in the report, we have this section called the mythological perfect school. And usually this is where I get chuckles whenever I've been sharing this with various audiences, because it kind of goes down this whole list of what we found the average family, knowing there is, of course, no average family in a sense,
Right. Sure.
but knowing that these are the things that they are looking for within that quote unquote perfect school. And to back up for a second, we actually did a conjoint analysis. So we tried this a different way in this report, where we actually tried to throw up an analysis of, or we tried to show for families, school A and school B. And each one of them had these 8 different factors that families look for in schools, certain type of, it's like athletics, arts, what's the cost of the school. And we would have these different levels, 2 or 3 levels within each of those that we would test. And so families would actually get on their computer screen, they get, here's school A, and they had the varying factors in school B. And we would actually say, okay, which one do you prefer? And they would pick, say, school B. And then we would ask the follow-up question of, would you actually enroll in that school? And so with that, that's how we came up with this sort of mythological perfect school. And it's a mythological perfect school because what it creates is this pretty much unattainable level. Unless you have an institution that has so much internal resources that they can actually make that happen. It's virtually and nearly impossible to do every single thing that those families want. But what I find interesting is that in that section, there's some good little nuggets of information. Uh, so when we look at each of the factors, such as social emotional learning, for example, we found out in that report what, and maybe what's not surprising, really what families are looking for and what's really impacting their decision. Because that's what we looked at was, well, how would then this impact your decision positively or negatively when looking at an independent school? We found that, if you're a school overall that prioritizes traditional success measures over wellness and social emotional learning, it's slightly positive. That's kind of your base case scenario. But if you've swung in a different direction where you're prioritizing that wellness and social emotional learning over other traditional success measures, families experience that in a negative way. In other words, when families were seeing that in schools, they viewed that as a bit negative, almost a more of a reason potentially not to consider a school. That's not the case clearly in again, this is on average.
Yeah.
But what families mentioned they wanted was that balance, right? So school that prioritizes wellness, social emotional learning, along with traditional success measures, that was seen as clearly as a positive. But to your point, that's asking a school to take on a lot of work. I mean, there's only so many hours in the day. There's only, so much so much money that we can do. Then we also know that for the younger generation, they want to see that evidence. Well, okay, now how are you, providing a balance of wellness and social emotional learning in your school?
Right.
How are you, show me the evidence of that. So there's a lot of different challenges in all of this, but there's also some ways in which I've heard heads, enrollment leaders, senior leadership teams, boards, taking some of that data and saying, how does this apply potentially to our set of parents, both who are currently in our community and who we're seeing come through the admission pipeline, and looking to do their own research on that level.
This is going to be my follow-up. It's like, it all comes down to, like, do you have good strategy? Like at the end of the day, if you know that these are the constraints, you know that these are the pressures, great. It's great to know what they are. Like, it's like, if you can articulate them and have them down, then you can sit back, reflect, and respond with really meaningful strategy that allows you to carve out your position in the market so that you're separating from all of the different competitors in the space. And I don't make any money by promoting this book, but like Tom Olverson's book, Leading Through Strategy.
Oh, I love it too. I had Tom on the pod as well, and I love that. I read it. I think I was one of the few times I was actually able to get outside and read this summer, and that was one of the books. But I got there. It was great.
I mean, and Tom talks about it. I mean, for a head of school, he lays out a beautiful path in terms of how do you build that kind of strategic unfair advantage in your market. So I encourage folks to pick up a copy if they haven't. I think I refer it all the time. So I just think it's brilliantly written. Hey, one of the things. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I second that completely. It was a great book.
Yeah. Tom's the best. One of the things that I thought was really interesting here is that your report helped uncover that families are like figuring out these complex strategies in order to fund in independent schools. Maybe it's grandparents, maybe they're borrowing early from 529, negotiating discounts, like all the things, right? So I guess my question is, like, what does that complexity mean for schools as they're talking about affordability, and how can they support families as they're supporting families through the admission journey?
Yeah, this is another really important aspect to the report. And as we look at what we're doing in our schools and those philosophies, and it's interesting when we look back even of who responded to this survey, 49% were first generation independent school students. And we define that in this report as meaning neither their parents nor their grandparents attended an independent school. So even when I look at that aspect, we've got 51% who responded to this survey applying to our schools where they know us. They're familiar on some level of the process with financial assistance, how to apply, all of those.
They went to one, they already had a child enrolled in one.
Yeah, exactly. They're applying as an 8th grader to now a new school, but starting in 9th grade.
Yeah.
But yet we've got 49% of applicants on the other side who have no experience to this and are most likely, when we look at where they're going first on the websites, tuition and fees, they're going to be experiencing some sticker shock and not understanding or knowing that financial assistance is available. So there's that aspect, even in terms of communication and what we're doing in that that start of the funnel and in the admission process. But it was concerning to me when I looked at some of these results was that families who were receiving financial assistance and who responded to our report or our survey, 9% that said that who were receiving financial assistance were also taking out personal loans.
Yeah.
And for me, I guess I had a moment where I thought that is high.
That's actually shocking to me, to be honest with you. Like that there was I remember 10, 15 years ago, there were companies out there that were servicing loans into our space, but I thought a lot of that had kind of disappeared.
I did too. That was it. So when we saw that number, I said, this can't be right, is it? And what's interesting is I was just presenting out at MISBO, their conference in Nashville, and did a pre-conference workshop with, as you can imagine, most of the room was filled with CFOs, but also some associate and assistant heads and heads. And when I asked the question, I said, "Is this what you're seeing?" A lot of head nodding, and which was interesting. See that, and even some conversation around handling that, and also what we're setting. Are we setting parents and families up to have some financial struggles with all of this? I was on a podcast not too long ago with Mark Mitchell and Amada Torres from NEIS, and NEIS has a report they came out with looking at specifically at families who apply for financial assistance, and we're comparing the two. And Mark Mitchell was saying that, they're seeing more conversations in schools around what the total cost of as an independent school education was, our total cost beyond tuition, because we know there's more. And we found that in our report too, that tuition covers 90% of total educational expenses. So in other words, families, whether they're full pay or receiving financial assistance, there's another 10% that families are incurring. And those were things
like school trips, buses, books.
all of it.
Yeah.
And Mark and Amada were talking about the fact that how important it is to not just be educating prospective families and current families about the total costs and being transparent about that, but also with faculty and staff. So because they're the ones also that are working directly with advisees who may have to be aware of these things and help families advocate. But they noticed also there's an increase. I think it was Mark said something about at least 1/3 of people who responded to their survey had at least one parent who took on a second job or increased work hours, which had been an increase from their survey 5 years ago.
What was the jump again? What was it?
I'll have to look that one up.
That's okay. That's all right. Yeah. But but they're seeing an increase in that in that overall.
Yeah, and what's interesting is Mark and Amada made the point with that data point was also around the willingness to pay it, and almost suggesting that there is a willingness for families to make it possible for their children, and that has grown over the 5 years. But it also means there's an increase in stress in that particular situation.
Right. People can only flex so much.
Right.
Right. You can only flex so much. I'm curious, out of this report, from a strategy point of view, did you look into like flexible tuition, individual index tuition, like individual tuition, like all the different models that kind of reframe financial aid?
We didn't. So that is something we did not get into in this specific report. We didn't look at different ways in which folks offer financial support. We didn't ask families about that. We went more into, again, it was kind of that willingness to pay, ability to pay, what they are actually paying, and also to get it, like, also the different ways in which they were paying. For example,
do you think though that that's a strategy? Like, like, hey, let's take a step back. Let's create the bands. Let's have more transparency. I don't know if it's the best solution or not. I think it's, context matters, your situation matters, right? Like not all strategies are equal for every school, but what's your thought on that?
I think that schools, it's important for them to look at what's working and not working, and really look at their, look within their own institution, also explore what others are doing, especially their competitors. I think if there's anything they can do that can help ultimately with the transparency around it, and from what we see from families between the Ride to Independent Schools report and this current Perceptions of Value and Affordability report, families are they find it very confusing. The whole application process we know is stressful, but the financial aid process, and we did actually, this is actually one that I loved that came out of our report was we looked at what families reported as sort of high concerns around cost for an independent school. And we looked at that by household income bands, everywhere from anything under, I think, $50,000 a year with household income up to $500,000 more. And what's
Yeah.
interesting is you see every single band has concern of at least 27% of those families. Obviously, it goes up as the household income levels go down. But what's interesting was to see at families who have a household income of $500,000 more, about somewhere around, I'm remembering off the top of my head here, I think it's around 27%, said, yeah, cost is a big concern for me as I'm looking at independent schools. So I think, the more, and for some of those families, they're, especially if they've got 3 kids who are going to be going or are enrolled in independent schools, they very well may qualify for financial assistance. But I think that anything that can add a little more transparency to the process, make it easier for families to understand, I think those are all things worth looking into in terms of, financially methodologies and systems that they're using.
Yeah, I've been reading. I read this. I mean, maybe you read it too, but it's Unreasonable Hospitality about 11 Madison Park.
That's on my list, Peter. I have
Yeah.
that on my list. I'm so excited.
Yeah, we're doing a book club on it inside of Moonshot Lab. I'm super psyched about it, and
Good choice.
it's it's all about like how do you create an exceptional experience for people, like that marries like precision with hospitality. Right.
Yep.
And I think there's such great stuff to learn from that. In fact, I've said this on the pod a couple of times, like the author is my dream guest. Like I want to get him on the pod. It'd be so much fun to kind of break that all down. Given like all these other conversations that have been on the pod, it all kind of leads to that. I just think there's something very interesting about unreasonable hospitality. Christina, earlier on, you were talking about how price and willingness to pay, and equating higher tuition with higher quality. But yet, there's also seems like there's this kind of bubbling movement to look at price and potentially reset it. I've profiled a couple of schools that have done it well. Like, how do schools navigate that? Knowing that there's like this quality bar associated with price, but yet, when you start to look at your market and realize if you reset your price, you have a broader market that you can recruit. Like, I'm curious, like where's your mind on that one?
Well, one of the places I go to is looking at the behavioral economics also, and thinking of things like price signaling, price elasticity, and how do those also play a role. I feel like that's something, and I say that because some of the feedback we've received from heads, CFOs, senior enrollment leaders, leadership teams, boards, this report has, in some ways, for some schools, they've been discussing this for a long time, but for others, it's allowing them some discussion questions. It's bringing up a lot of these different ways of thinking about it. And, and I think about price signaling, for example, there's a lot of research that shows that absent of other information, the more something costs, the higher quality people will think it is. And that's across many sectors. We know this even in higher ed. But I think that's important as it directly relates to reality and perception. So again, that idea of families go to, if they don't know anything about our school and they're going directly to the tuition site on our webpage, they see a $60,000 tuition, they look at another school at $70,000. Going off of this research, it would tell us that parent perceptions, they're more likely to think that $70,000 tuition school is offering a better quality education, better quality overall. And obviously, I'm not saying that's the case. It's just that's what research shows. And I guess where I'm going with this is on the Enrollment Spectrum podcast, we had Professor Manoj Thomas, who was a Sabanci professor of marketing and management at Cornell's College of Business. And he actually dove really deep into pricing and around tuition. And he was talking about, when we think about tuition setting, I think, and I'm probably going to botch this a little bit, but so people probably want to go listen to the actual that particular podcast and actually hear from him. But from what I recall, it was something like first, price. When we're looking at price, it's how much money are people, willing to part with. And price also has this second role, which is sort of this indicator of quality. And we need to be aware of that when we're looking at things like tuition. And And we want that. He was talking about this sort of seesaw method where price shouldn't be so high that it feels like an economic burden, but not so low that families are suspicious of the quality of the school, and keeping that balance, which is really challenging to do.
I would add one more thing to it because I've done a lot of work, like kind of looking at the successful ones, and I agree with everything there. And I think there's one more kind of leg to that stool, which is if you're going to reduce your price, you have to amplify your value,
Yeah.
right? Like it has to be part of a bigger strategy that conveys higher value. And so that when you look at that lower price point, people can look around and say, oh, but this is amazing. Like this is an incredible offer, a pack priced here. And you've seen schools that have done that, like Soundview School out here, Providence Country Day. I profiled both of them on the pod, and they talk about that. Hey, last question for today. Looking ahead, if you could give one piece of advice to heads of school and boards as they digest the report, what would it be?
One piece of advice I would have when digesting this report, I would actually start from the back of the report. It might be an easy, just given, look, I've worked in independent schools for many years. Before my job at EMA, I know what the school year is like. I know, but in the back, that's where we have all the key takeaways. We also added a few really key supporting data points for each of those key takeaways. And that's where we have the guiding questions. Yeah. So if you start at the back, it gives you a big picture of what we're about to jump into in the report. And then when you actually have the time, and I know that's difficult to find, go piece by piece. I think for most, it's pretty hard to get through the entire report in one sitting. So take it through chunks. And then that's where also I would, in tandem, look at the data dashboards. We actually have data dashboards for our member schools where they can actually slice and dice more of that data, especially as, many of our schools are always saying, well, this is great, but how does this relate specifically to a school like mine? And this is where you can look at things such as we're going to sort for parents who just looked at boarding versus day schools. We want to look at sorting the data based on household income for families. There's different ways you can look at that. Yeah. It's great. I would then take that into board retreats, to senior leadership team retreats, and check out also on the Enrollment Spectrum podcast, we have a mini series that's dedicated to this report where we're bringing in different experts around things like behavioral economics, marketing communications, a variety of things that go with this, that if you're not ready to dive into the full report, you can get some nuggets from that as well.
Great advice. Christina Dotchin, VP of Member Relations at the Enrollment Management Association. As always, thank you for sharing. It's just such a fascinating problem to unpack. There's lots of complexity, but once you have the information, you can really you can use that for good. So thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. No, thank you for having me. This has been really fun. It's been great to talk about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina.
Thanks, Peter.